From the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
As we welcome you to today's program, we'd like to announce that our topic for today is dealing with history of the people and events of the Inland Northwest. We have a gentleman with us who has lived a long and wonderful life. He's from Fairfield, Washington. He is 86 years old. Our guest is Glen Adams. In addition to being an observer of history over much of this century, he has also been a publisher in the sense that he has advertised and published the works of other people in what is called the Galen Press, that he headquarters in Fairfield, Washington. And in this are over 600 numbers of what we call ISBN numbers, in fact 680, and it deals with such areas of history as the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, Indian history, rare Americans, Northwest history, church-related Western history, and the list goes on. Mr. Adams, it's a pleasure to have you on our program, and we look forward to talking about your work and how you have advertised these works of others and some of the experiences both they and you know about concerning our history of our part of the world. Again, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have regular panelist Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and we shall ask Janelle Burke to commence the questioning on Inland Northwest history with our guest, Glen Adams.
Thank you, Tony. Mr. Adams, it's a pleasure to have you here. You were born in 1912, a year that's very important to me because that's the year that my father was born. My mother was born in 1913. So you were born in 1912. Where were you born?
I was born in Trent, Washington, the site of the Kaiser Rolling Mill.
So you're born where Kaiser now stands.
Right, well, almost. I went back once to take a look, and those knuckleheads had mislocated the building by about 50 or 75 feet. As near as I could figure out, I was born where the parking lot is now, so the oil from the workers' heaps drips down on that sacred ground.
And you grew up in the Inland Northwest. The Great Depression came along at a part of your life. What was the life like in this Inland Northwest during the Great Depression?
It wasn't easy. I think we may have been better off than some people because my father was doing some subsistence farming, so we always had something to eat, but money was a little scarce.
By this time, where was your family located?
Fairfield, Washington. Father inherited some land on the death of his mother, Anna L. Moore Adams, in late summer of 1923. He got 80 acres of real good Palouse land and 80 acres of hill pasture land that was ancestral horse pasture. But the 80 that he got had no water on it and no buildings. And that was a kind of a handicap. So he had sense enough to sell the 80 of good land, and they bought 2 more 80s of hill pasture land and 300 acres adjoining that to the south. So we had 540 acres in one block. And the property that he bought to the south had a real good year-round spring. It had a log barn, it had a frame barn, and it had a 3-room house built in the 1870s. And we lived in that house. It, of course, didn't have any electricity, didn't have any running water, and the plumbing was out the back door, which my sister Maybelle was 13 years old, and she didn't appreciate it because the outdoor plumbing didn't have a door on it. But we lived there in 1925. And next year, Father built a new house, and in the 1940s, after I married the city kid, that was a reckless thing to do, I remodeled the farmhouse and then walked off and left it as I was had the first severe symptoms of MS about February 47, and this got worse instead of better, and I was forced to change occupations. and I took the postmastership in Fairfield, which I held for 21 years. And then I shifted over to book printing.
How long in those days did it take to travel from Fairfield to Spokane?
Well, it depends on if you walked it or rode in a car. And some people...
But didn't you use horses and wagons too, some in the very earliest days? Or
Oh,
were
yes.
you always car-bound?
My father usually had an automobile, but that didn't mean it would operate. And lots of times I took a team of wagon, much more dependable than his $25 cars.
So back to my original question, how long would it take you to go with your team and wagon up to Spokane for supplies?
Oh, it'd take all day.
And today, about how long does it take, do you think?
Well, about 45 minutes driving.
So the inland Northwest has certainly become much more compact in terms of time.
It's a different world. The population accumulates in cities, and some of the small towns often lose population. Fairfield's been pretty lucky. We were the newest of the towns in southern Spokane County. We didn't get started until 1889, and now we're the strongest of those towns. But for one thing, we have almost 2 million bushels of grain storage. That's a top farming area. And we have a strong bank, a strong grocery store, and a dentist who's getting rich, and we have a local nursing home that has quite a payroll. And farm machinery is big business down there. We have 2 major machinery companies.
I would also ask about education at that time. Going back to when you first went to the 80s and you were going to live now on the farm, where did you go for school? And was it readily available?
Well, in 1918, I was 6 years old, and my sister was 16 months younger. And my mother had taught school in Colville for 2 years before her marriage. I was very legitimate. I was born in 1909. No, I was born in 12. The marriage was 1909. I got them mixed up. It was before the days of school buses, so my mother was determined that Glen and my sister Maybelle would go to school. So that's one reason we came to Fairfield, and also my father's parents were getting old, and my father rented a little bit of the farmland, and he also had a 3/4-ton Chevrolet truck. It didn't have lights, at least it didn't work. And it had solid rubber tires in back and pneumatics in front, and a chain drive, a 1916 Republic truck. But he did quite a little trucking with it, and so we kind of made a living that way.
I want to talk some about your publications. You indicated that you left the farm and you became a postmaster for a long period of time, and then you opened up your publishing. And I introduced the program with the announcement that this is the Yagalian Press. Tell us a little bit more about when you moved into this and how that got you so involved with history. And I also introduced some of the subjects that you are advertising, and I do have a copy of the publication right here that I'll just briefly show to the audience. You've been in this business now a long time too, haven't you?
I started Yagalian Press in the spring of 1937. That's 61 and a half years ago.
So this has been the longest career of all.
It's been a long, long time. I was still a student at Cheney. I did my first printing 2 years earlier, but I was working at the college print shop. I didn't own a press of my own until 1937. I think over the years I've owned 19 different printing presses, trying to upgrade the situation.
Give us some wonderful stories from your list of publications here that involve history of our area here. Give us 1 or 2 stories that you think are of great interest to the people today.
There'd be a number of choices. One that comes to my mind, a book, full-sized, quarto book was written by Florence Sherfy, and that's entitled, wait a minute, I lost it, Vanished Grist Mills and the Men Who Ran Them. See, before we had electricity or steam power, the only power available was animal power or else water power. And a number of these mills were established as ways to grind grain in pioneer days. The author found 5 of them. That got interesting. She kept on digging, found about 75. And each chapter is preceded by a hand-drawn map locating these pioneer grist mills, none of which are operating anymore. And I believe we lost Florence Sherfy a few months back. She was in her 90s. So,
tell us a little bit more about the grist mills and all the settlers of that time. They would all use this because that was an important part of the diet, was it not?
Well, you can cook wheat. I remember my mother doing it in Depression days. It's best to get the chaff out of it first, but it was very cheap, so we cooked it and ate it for breakfast. However, it was customary to not use wheat directly, but to have it ground into flour. Mm-hmm. And these pioneer mills did that. Also, some of these pioneer mills sawed lumber before they had steam power. Joe Henry's mill, close to Fairfield, down in the Hangman Creek Canyon, was a 3-story building. Now, it didn't have a water wheel, but it had a water turbine. And Joe Henry made flour there. Now, that's the second Joe Henry mill. The first one was on Rock Creek, and it sawed lumber, but the second one ground flour only.
In addition to the grinding of flour, also, especially back east, where I come from, I heard some of the historians talk about also cornmeal for cornbread as well as flour. They could grind both, could they not?
Well, I got my fill of cornbread in World War I. We couldn't buy much wheat flour, but you can get all kinds of ground up corn, so we used that. It works.
Yes, you could do both. Janelle Burke.
Well, there are some very interesting titles in your among your publications. Some of them have to do with letters from someone or a person's own autobiography. Can you pick some letters that were of particular interest?
I could try. Every time I print a book of old letters, I get nervous. I think, who's going to buy this? And every time it sells out. One of them that comes to my mind, and it never was intended for publication, is the letters of Narcissa Whitman. I printed it 3 times. And I printed other books of letters and a number of diaries and travel accounts, Oregon Trail and California Trail particularly.
With regard to Narcissa Whitman, could you explain for our viewers who she was and why she is important to Northwest history?
Well, she and her husband, Marcus Whitman, came to the Walla Walla area pretty early, 1836. And she also wrote another little book that never intended for publication, but she's gone now and probably doesn't know anything about it, was her horseback journey out on the Oregon Trail in 1836. I printed that 3 times.
A diary, in other words.
A diary, yes.
And in her letters, who were her letters to or from?
Her letters mainly were sent back east to members of her family back in New York State particularly.
Did she like life in the West?
I think she was faithful to her husband. I'm sure she was, but she was a very nice person and wholly unsuited to be the wife of a missionary working with Native Americans at the time. The Indians hated her, and she was the only woman killed in the massacre. Now, Mrs. Henry Harmon Spaulding was not ashamed to get down and work with Indians, and she did much better. Her husband, while he was not mentally in very good shape, he went completely off his rocker following the Whitman massacre, was the most successful of these missionaries. Now, they were supposed to benefit the native peoples they worked with. Actually, in most cases, they were a detriment to them. They'd have been much better off never to have had these. Now, the Catholic missionaries Not much has been printed about them, but they were far more successful. The Coeur d'Alene's particularly refused to allow any white men except Catholic priests to live in the Coeur d'Alene country. The priests did leave Indian women alone, and other occupations did not leave Indian women alone. The Coeur d'Alenes were jealous of their women, very jealous. And that's one reason that Steptoe had his defeat at Rosalia in 1858.
Let's talk a little bit about in those earlier times, like when your father and mother's time, and I'm sure they shared a lot of wonderful stories with you, and even in your early years, other than what we've already talked about concerning schooling and those kind of things, what was life like? I know that one had a lot of obligations on the farm, maybe from early morning to late at night, but what type of entertainment did you have, or breaks from your work, and what was the family doing other than the hard work?
In grade school days, we used to get together and play pinochle. I haven't played pinochle for many years, but we did as children. And we did, when we moved out in the country, which was February 22nd, 1924, I was 11 years old, we rode ponies to school. Now, sometimes in nice weather, we'd turn the ponies loose and they'd go home by themselves, but you couldn't be caught dead walking to school. But it was all right to walk away from school.
Why was that? Why was it?
Well, it was just the way we felt at the time. I rode a very nice saddle mare named Ginger, and my sister Maybelle had a pony named Star that my father had purchased for $4. And I always felt that that was an overcharge, because Star was an Indian cayuse and lacked dependability, where Ginger was ladylike and very dependable. We had them around for years.
When you turned them loose, they always went home, did they, the ponies?
The horses would go home by themselves, and Ginger could open the gate and let herself in. She was quite nice about it. I don't think Star ever could. The Star's IQ was lower.
So animals do have different levels of sensibility, don't they? How long was the school year?
Well, it was 9 months. I have no regrets going to a one-room country school. It didn't have electricity. It didn't have running water. It did have a pump out in the front of the building. You could pump it and get water to drink. But we had a real good teacher. Her name was Marguerite Dockendorf. And I have no regret about going to a one-room country school for 2 years. And afterwards, we went back to Fairfield schools.
And one-room school, how many grades did you have in that room?
Theoretically 8, but sometimes there wasn't anybody to fill a grade, so that slot would be vacant.
Yes, and one teacher dealt with all those students.
One teacher handled the whole thing.
Yes.
Janelle, she was very competent.
Yes.
Better than some of the teachers today.
Janelle Burke.
You have known a lot about history in the area, and I'm sure you've traveled a lot to the various places in the Northwest. Where would you suggest that people go if they wanted to see some history right up firsthand? Are there some places that are favorites of yours that people should go to see?
One place that I would suggest, but it's a little ways to drive, is down to the confluence of the Snake River and Columbia River. I remember in 1924, I was 13 years old, and I was on a little trip with my father, and he drove me out to this spot and tried to explain this is very important because Lewis and Clark camped here on their return journey. And all there was a 4-inch wooden piece of lumber driven in the ground with a piece of typing nailed to the top of the 4-inch post explaining that Lewis and Clark camped there. Now there's a regular park there.
One of the other places, too, is the site of some of the mission sites are still available, aren't they?
Yes, and there's a monument where Steptoe was surrounded, just east of Rosalia. There's a monument there, and that's pretty easy to drive to. And there are other sites, not as well known. There were some up in the Colville country because that was really settled before the Palouse country was. There was a Hudson Bay farm there and a trading post. The Walla Walla country, of course, was settled before the Palouse. The North Palouse was one of the last districts to be settled and one of the better ones. Southern Spokane County is on the north edge of the Palouse, and that's a very rich farming country.
I take it that in your publications you have more publications that deal with farming and agriculture in general than you do with mining or timber.
You are almost right, but not quite. I think I don't have too many on farming. I have a few. We do have some on timber, logging, and we do have a few on mining.
All of that was very important to this region, I take it.
Well, see, the first people here were fur traders, traveling fur traders. And the first ones came in 1 or 2 years after Lewis and Clark. They were 1805, 1806. Following that, we had missionaries come in, which were not always a blessing to the people they were supposed to be helping. And then we had livestock men, both sheep ranchers and cattlemen. That was very important, and these were followed by farmers that particularly grew wheat. We also had other men, a few other occupations, but not too many. Those were the major ones. This reminds me that I printed a book. Now, what was the name of it? Anyway, it was a life of Mary, oh boy, I lost it. She was the second wife of Chief Joseph, a Columbia Indian, and she was grown up in 1858 when Wright hanged Qualchan 4¼ miles east of Fairfield, and that's a good site to visit for historical interest. She lived through part of the missionary period, part of the fur trade period, through the construction of railroads in the 1880s, through the construction of highways all past 1900, and well into an age of air travel. She lived to be 112 or 13 years old, and I have the only biography of her. She was quite a remarkable woman, and a full sister to Qualchan, who was hanged by George Wright, and that gave Hangman Creek its name.
Along those lines, I know after you've published all of these works of other people, and you've studied this for over 60 years in the publications that you do, you must have from the religious community or the political community and the business community, the workforce, some individuals that stand out that you think contributed so much to this area. Would you share with us one or two individuals that you have great admiration for their contribution?
There were so many that I'm a little bit puzzled. One of the early men who had something to do with our history was George Wright. Now, he was a capable Army officer, a much better officer than Steptoe was. Steptoe, when he was defeated in 1858, was suffering from what they call creeping paralysis. He was not in good health. Now, actually, what he had was MS, the same thing that I have. He lived only a few years after the battle. I think he died about 1865, and the battle was May 16th, 1858. George Wright was a competent officer, and he made some agreements. He was not empowered to make treaties with Indians, but he made some agreements which the U.S. government did not adhere to. He promised the Indians in the Spokane Valley that they would be reimbursed for crops that were destroyed and so forth, and cattle that were killed by the soldiers. But the government never fulfilled those promises. But he was a better officer than most. We had other Army officers. One that I made a special study of was Lawrence Kipp. Now, Kipp was much younger than Wright. In 1855, Lawrence Kipp was on the staff of Isaac Stevens when they made the treaty at Walla Walla, and I also have the only complete printing of the Treaty of 1855. Lawrence Kipp was on Wright's staff in 1858. He was 22 years old when they had the meeting with Coeur d'Alene Indians up the Coeur d'Alene River. He was very gentlemanly and left, as far as I know, no half-Indian children in the Northwest, which could not be said of some of the other officers. He was, of course, was an officer in the Civil War. Following this, he had an opportunity to marry Eva Laura Lard. Now, that was cigarette millions. And like any sensible man, he took it. And from that point on, I don't think he ever worked. He was interested in racehorses and a few other things like that. I researched him very carefully. The family won't tell you anything, but I have no detrimental information about Lawrence Kipp. He died about 1899, a few miles from where he was born, either in New York or New Jersey.
Certainly, from your knowledge of all these years and reading all these publications, I know that there would be a long list that we could get into of other leaders. But time is always the master on this program, and time has caught up with us. And on behalf of Janelle Berg and our staff, Glen Adams, thank you for coming and sharing these stories, both from your personal life and from the other people in the publications that you have. And I know you are preserving a lot of history that will be available in the future. And we thank you for being on this program, where we've also shared with our viewers throughout the Northwest just a little bit of that history. And we wish we had more time to share more. We thank you very much for being with us. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you've enjoyed our program. We'd like to invite you to be with us again next week at this same time, and we'll move to yet another issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.